now. I'm going to say that all again. My name's Greta. There we go. We're going to hold it. Good morning. My name is Greta. I'm the Director of Youth Ministry here, and if this is your first time,
we're going to use vocal mic number 1. Here you go, Greta.
Thank you.
Sorry that didn't work.
It's okay. Fourth time's the charm? Cool. Good morning. Thank you for being here. For those of you who have been here before, thank you. If you are continuously following along in our reading of the Bible, thank you for keeping up with it. It's no easy feat, and you made it to Job, so congrats. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, you picked a wonderful week to be here. You get me, and you get the book of Job. So, before I jump into content and all of the fun stuff that Job entails, I want to give you some context. Job is the oldest book of the Bible, the oldest scroll that we have access to, and that means that we don't know who authored this book. We have no idea who wrote it, and we don't know really who it was intended for. But Job wrestles with really important life questions that are applicable to our lives today. The universal question of human suffering and God's role in that is something that we as an audience today can still learn from. So this book wrestles with questions of why do we suffer? Why do good people suffer? Why do bad things happen to good people? And where does God fit into all of that? Our theme this week is suffering in the lives of the righteous. And our key verse, and what I want to kind of pull your attention to, is from Job book, chapter 42, verses 5 and 6. It reads, "My eyes had heard about you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore, I relent and find comfort on dust and ashes." This comes at the end of the book, where Job has been given some clarity, has had an interaction with God, and kind of realizes his place. I'll get into that later, but God quite literally asks Job, "Who are you to question me? Who do you think you are?" And Job, once seeing God and realizing God's awesome power, relents and kind of figures out where he fits into the world. So the book of Job opens, and the book of Job in whole kind of follows a pattern. The book of Job opens with a narrative, kind of third person. We, as an audience, are invited into the holy court of angels, and God is present, and the character Hasatan, who, socially we know as Satan, but I'm going to refer to that character as Hasatan, he is present, he is an angel. And God asks him, "What have you been up to? Where have you been?" And Hasatan replies, "Oh, I've just been walking to and fro, up and down the earth, simply existing." And God then says, "Have you noticed my servant Job?" Socially and in Job's community and time, Job was ideal Christian. He had it made. He had the best livestock, the best crops, best family. He was the most devout. He never once questioned God's presence, grace in his life. And so God points him out and says, "Have you noticed my servant Job? Look at how great he is." And Hasatan questions, why has Job never doubted you, never cursed you, never been upset with you? I bet that I can make that happen in Job's life. And so God says, "Sure, do what you want with Job's life, just don't touch him. Don't touch him." And so this leads Job to losing everything. He lost his crops, his livestock, his family, his children, his livelihood, everything that gave him status and role and importance in his life. And so then, in this, Job is devastated. He just lost everything. And in Job's time, when someone was mourning and going through a time of grief, they would rip their clothes, rip their cloak, and cover their head in dust and ashes. And Job did this to signal to his peers that he was in mourning. But never once in this time did Job curse God or blame God for for what happened in his life. And so Hasatan goes back to the court of angels, and once again, God's like, where have you been? What have you been doing? And Hasatan replies, just walking around the earth, to and fro. Never once does he specifically said, I went and made Job's life terrible. He just existed. And God once again says, okay, this time you can do whatever you want to Job, just don't kill him. And this time around, Job is covered in sores, and he is sick, and he is disgusting, and he has now lost all socials. He doesn't have anyone who wants to be near him. And it is this time where Job's wife comes to him and says, why don't you just curse God and die? That seems like an easier option for you right now. But Job doesn't. And this book, and hopefully what I'll do, is explain how Job maintained his faith through trauma. And so the book of Job gives us insight on how Job responds to the trauma he endured. And this serves as a guide for how we can respond to trauma in our life. And I use the word trauma intentionally. This wasn't just a bad day for Job. This was horrible, gut-wrenching, life-altering months, years, decades, possibly. Job, because of this, Job is one of the most relatable books today. I bet if I asked, I'd see all of your hands go up if you've experienced some type of trauma, or if you've ever felt like Job, if you've felt like you've lost everything and you have no one to blame but God. This book, for me, highlights the character of Job and the character of humanity even more than the character of God. It is so easy to look at this book and say, okay, well, God just abandoned Job. He just handed Job over to Hasatan and said, do what you want. But that's not entirely true. At the beginning of the book, we hear God say, have you noticed my servant Job? This implies that God had been noticing and continuously notices Job. He has been watching over Job his whole life and continues to do so during times of trial. So I have good news and bad news. We're going to do bad news first. Bad news, we will encounter and experience trauma on earth while we're here. It's inevitable. Because Hasatan, because bad things just exist in the world, we are bound to encounter them at some point in our lives. Now, our suffering may not look like Job's. It could be grief, it could be anxiety, depression, mental health issues, loss, a global pandemic, even the effects of systemic racism or any other situation that leads us individually or corporately to feel disconnected from God. Good news is, part of what makes humanity good is our ability to empathize and to understand each other's suffering and pain, because we've likely felt something similar. The book of Job, as I mentioned, kind of sets up a pattern. So in the beginning, we get a third-person kind of narrative, and then we move into dialogue, first person. And in the dialogue, something happens to Job, and then Job complains about it, and then typically one of his friends will come in and talk to him about it, and then God will talk to him about it, or he'll pray about it, and then we'll get a couple filler verses, and then it starts all over again with Job complaining, and then someone talking to Job and Job lamenting. And so the people other than Job in the book that we meet are Job's closest friends. And so when Job when his life fell to pieces initially, Job's friends showed up. They traveled to where he was, and they ripped their clothes in solidarity and sat and covered themselves in ash in solidarity, and they sat with Job for 7 full days and said nothing. They sat with him in silence. The issues begin when Job's friends open their mouths. Job's friends should have just sat and been there and been present with him. But when Job's friends start talking, they assume that God is punishing Job, that Job had done something wrong to deserve this stuff in his life. And I'm sure we've all felt that as well. So Job's friends' initial empathy is what we should be called to do for ourselves and for each other, to be present and patient and just there. This is also where we kind of find the good news in this book. And the good news for me is that the worst thing is never the last thing. Adversity, trauma, and any other kind of bad stuff does not invalidate our faith. It does not invalidate the love that God has for us. Job saw this and he understood this. And Job's faith is the essential key in this book. Job understood that if God can provide the good stuff in his life, God will also be there and be present during the bad stuff. Job had a certain clarity that comes with experiencing adversity and trauma. And I feel like we've also experienced that clarity when we've felt like we lost everything and we're forced to rely on God. I talked earlier about Job's wife. We can see that she did not have the same clarity that Job had because she didn't understand that God was faithful and present with them in the midst of their pain. This question of human suffering and why does bad stuff happen to good people shows up in our world everywhere. It is so common, and it might not look like the book of Job just standing out in random TV shows, but some shows reference Job directly, or other shows, keeping with Eric's theme from last week, like WandaVision, entirely focus on the concept of grief and how we deal with that. And we can see different characters who have clarity and those who don't. Similarly, many authors, both religious and secular alike, talk about grief and how we handle it, and the stages of grief. I'm sure you've heard of them, and how we deal. Parker Palmer, the author of Let Your Life Speak, writes that dormancy and deep rest are essential to all living things. The season of winter is a time where we are inclined to follow nature's cue and retreat underground to renew ourselves and prepare ourselves for spring. I don't know about you guys, but I despise winter. Winter is the worst season. It's cold and it's just sad and just gross, and I don't like it. And oftentimes when people are experiencing adversity, they relate it to seasons of winter or seasons of isolation. We are in the midst of this hibernation, just like Job was throughout the book. We are currently in the season of Lent, and this is the invitation to retreat, re-examine, and reprioritize our lives in preparation for new life, in preparation for spring. We are just like Job. We are sitting in the ash, preparing for what comes next. We can see the proverbial finish line, both in a liturgical sense and in a social sense. Like Christy mentioned in that story she shared with us, Job had the ability to switch from asking why to ask what's next. And we also have the ability to do so. But throughout the book, oftentimes, Job does ask why. And originally, Job doesn't get the happy ending that we read in most common translations. And towards the end of the book, right before we switch back into a narrative from the dialogue portion, Job encounters God in what we call the whirlwind, like a literal whirlwind. Job's interaction with God, it's an interesting read. If you haven't read it, I would invite you to go read that specific chapter. And God, like I said, essentially asked Job, "Who are you to question me? Where were you when I created life? You are not God. I am God." And this kind of switched a flip for Job to realize, yeah, I'm not God. I'm just a measly little human. I don't know what else happened in order for me to experience this, and maybe I don't need to. Job then apologizes to God, and he's like, yeah, you're right. I'm not you, and you are so much more powerful than I can understand, and so I relent to your will, and I'll take what you've given me. Added endings in other translations end up with Job receiving everything back in full, with God rewarding Job's loyalty and patience and devoutness with 2 times everything, 2 times the land, 2 times the livestock, 2 times the crop, 2 times the children. He gets everything back. And like Job, in that sense, we have a happy ending to look forward to. We can sit in our ash and dust now, and we can sit with our feelings and with the trauma, but we can know and we can await and anticipate the coming of Easter and the new life and the new covenant that comes with that. Most people see Job and they grimace and they avoid it because it forces them to sit with feelings that they're not comfortable with. It forces them to re-examine the trauma that they've experienced. But I look at Job and I see hope for humanity and comfort in that God is steadfast and present with us when we feel like Job. I leave you with notes that trauma, adversity, and hard stuff in our life does not invalidate our faith. It can shake it, and that's allowed, but it does not invalidate it, and at no point has God abandoned you, and at no point will God abandon you. Would you join me in a word of prayer? Loving and gracious God, I thank you so much for your steadfast and unconditional love and presence in our lives. I thank you for the adversity that we've experienced and for the ways in which it has made us stronger. Your love is a gift, and it is something that we have the ability to share with those around us. And I pray that as we move through our lives in this week, we find ways to share your love and your empathy with those around us. As we go towards this week, I pray that you open our hearts and minds to the ways in which we may share your love with others, and that we may find new ways to be in relationship with you. It's in your name we pray. Amen.